We're almost to the end of the semester, but I've posted a new schedule on the Moodle site just to cover essentially this week, the beginning of next week, and a week after that. We're not actually far off the originally posted schedule, but just to give you an idea of what's happening. With that in mind, for Wednesday, I would like you to read chapter 17 in Poland. This is on the ethics of eating animals. So my hope is to finish the section today on what organic food is. Wednesday, also you have your GMO report. We're going to spend a few days talking about the ethics of eating animals, because it can get to be kind of a little hairy sort of area of food philosophy. Then after we do that, we're going to revisit economics just for a short, brief period of time. We've talked off and on about classical economics, and so I want to talk to you and expose you to the ideas of ecological economics, which is a brand of economics that kind of arose at the University of Maryland back in the early 2000s. There's a economist there who has a Nobel Prize in economics who has done a lot of work on ecological economics that runs counter to classical economics, not surprisingly. And then after that, we'll spend some time looking at the distribution of food availability in the Kansas City area. And so we'll talk about food deserts. We'll actually spend some time playing around with a map that a couple of semesters worth of ecology food students have done in mapping the outlets for buying food around the Kansas City area. That map is complete now, and so you don't have to help generate the data that went into the map, but we'll spend some time looking at the data that were generated by other people. And then that's kind of the end of the semester. You're going to get an email, if you haven't gotten it already, about doing course evaluations. Save those until the last day of class. There's a section in the syllabus for filling out course evaluations. So don't fill them out when you get it. We'll do that on the last day of class. And then the last thing that you're going to have to do is a very brief written response to the food desert map that we're going to look at after Thanksgiving. So the food desert map is interesting because it kind of shows what kinds of food outlets are located around the Kansas City area. The reason that I started doing this is I was struck a number of years ago when they started building new food outlets around Liberty. So within 5 miles of my house, actually probably closer within 2 miles of my house, I can shop at Aldi, or Walmart, or Target, or the new Price Chopper, or the old Price Chopper, or the new Hy-Vee. I have 5 major supermarket kind of outlets for food within a couple of miles of my house, which seems obscene to me that there would be that kind of availability when there are other places where within a couple of miles of your house you may have a convenience store. And so this is kind of what's defined as food desert. Geographic areas, at least defined by some researchers, geographic areas where you're not within a mile of an outlet for getting food, and then other people will define it as being within a certain distance of getting food at something like a supermarket. So there are some parts of Kansas City where you can get food, but it's almost all available in things like convenience stores. Imagine if your main food outlet was Cody's, which during the growing season this year, Cody's has actually had some fresh produce. I think they must know a farmer who sells their produce just inside the door of Cody's. But imagine if your only source of food was fast food and convenience stores. You would then have a different universe of food opportunities than if your nearest food outlet was a Hy-Vee or a Price you'll write a brief reflection paper about that. Because one of the questions is, in these food deserts where there aren't supermarkets, it seems to me like the law of supply and demand would prompt supermarket corporations to put supermarkets in these areas that lack supermarkets, because if you're the only supermarket in town, who's gonna shop there? Everybody. Yet they don't put those supermarkets in those sections of town, and if you're near a supermarket is a long drive or a long bus ride away, you're less likely to frequent a supermarket, and you're more likely to frequent other food outlets. So we'll talk a little bit about food deserts. So that's the plan for the remainder of the semester. Questions? Yeah, Charlie.
About our paper due on
Yeah.
Wednesday, are we supposed to reference outside sources or just strictly use?
You can if you want, but I'm not expecting you to reference anything other than the National Academy of Science report.
Okay.
And so, but whenever you do talk about it, be sure and reference it, because I'm presuming that you knew nothing about any of this.
Yeah, if I'm gonna use it, I'll cite
Yeah.
it and everything.
Yeah, so cite it in text, and it would be totally appropriate if you only have one citation in your literature cited section. So I've been struggling with this with my ecology, my evolution and ecology students. You know, they're writing lab reports right now, and they have an introduction. In the introduction, virtually all of the information in the introduction was unknown to them prior to embarking on this research project. And so, you know, my expectation of their introduction is every sentence that they write should be accompanied by an in-text citation, because chances are that wasn't in your common base of knowledge before you started down this path. And my suspicion is the same is true with anything having to do with genetically engineered organisms in the food supply. So yeah, I should expect to see a lot of in-text citations, but they can all be the same citation.
So like some professors, just for the sake of easy reading, that you have several sentences that come from the same source, just put the citation like maybe in a paragraph.
Yeah, that's actually just decent writing. If it's clear from the writing that you're just continuing to write about the same source, then that body of information only needs one citation. But yeah, that's fine. You see that commonly in all kinds of writing. Oh yeah, any other questions about the GMO report? Before something just popped into my head. Other questions? Food blogging, food journaling. Start up your food journals again. Food blogging, there are prompts on the Moodle site now, so look at those. Take them in the order that they appear. So it says that in the instructions. So the first food blogging prompt has to do with whatever Thanksgiving myth that you grew up with. What's the Thanksgiving story that you were taught that you probably still carry around in your head to a certain degree? What is the story about Thanksgiving that you received, either from your parents, from your school, and from a combination of those things, from movie depictions of the Thanksgiving, art depictions of Thanksgiving, whatever. The second prompt is to describe what your Thanksgiving was when you were growing up. What was it like? Who was there? What did you eat? What things did you do during the day? I was a punter in football, and so Thanksgiving Day for me was almost always spent punting practice. I knew that my father would be home and he could always be on the receiving end. The bad thing about punting practice is if you're practicing by yourself, you have to keep retrieving the ball, which is no fun. I mean, it gets you some good cardio, but it's just better if there's a receiver at the end. And none of my three sisters were ever interested in doing punting practice. So the third prompt is, there is an article that I did not put on the Moodle site that I meant to this morning. There's an article that I want you to read. It's in Critiques in Anthropology. It is about the real history of Thanksgiving as researched by an anthropologist. That paper, it's on the long side. It goes from page 167 to 191 in the journal that it's published in. So it's kind of a long read, but it's not super technical. It's an anthropological sort of treatment. And I meant to put that up there with the food blogging prompts, but I'll get that up for you as soon as So your third prompt is, so first one is, what's your remembrance of what Thanksgiving is about? The second is, what is your Thanksgiving that you experienced as you were growing up? The third thing is to read this anthropological treatment of Thanksgiving and reflect on how that might or might not differ from what your kind of received education has been about Thanksgiving. And then the fourth prompt is the easiest prompt of all of them, which is just describe your Thanksgiving this year. So I'm assuming that most of you are probably going home. If you're not going home, then you're going to have a different Thanksgiving experience than everyone else. So do these in order. There are 4 prompts. Do them in order. The first 3 prompts require you to comment on other people's writing, because when it comes time to compare the kind of received myth that you were given in public schools and in popular culture is probably going to be very different than a studied anthropological take on Thanksgiving. And hopefully that will engender some good discussions in the comment section. So engage in that discussion in the comment section. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of a buzzkill, but that's okay. That's part of what college is about, is destroying misconceptions that you might or might not have about things like Thanksgiving. John?
So are all 4 of these prompts due by the end of the week, or?
December 2nd.
Oh, so
So
after Thanksgiving.
it'll span Thanksgiving.
Okay.
Yeah, a 2-week period.
Okay.
2-week period, just like before. Yeah, so take a look at those and get started on those. The first prompts you can do early on. Obviously, the last prompt you can't do until after Thanksgiving. It'll be interesting if reading this anthropology journal article, if that alters your conversations about Thanksgiving over the Thanksgiving table.
Just really ready to ruin our Thanksgiving this year?
No, it's just, I just find it interesting how we learn things and how we learn things differently when we're like in 3rd grade versus when we're in high school versus when we're in college. It's amazing to me the amount of incorrect information that I learned when I was in public schools. Everything from things like what Thanksgiving is like, to why we celebrate Christmas when we celebrate Christmas, to science stuff, like stuff that they taught me in high school that when I got to college, the things that I was taught weren't exactly untrue, they were just only true under certain special circumstances. And then when you get to college, you're taught about the nuance of that information. You're like, oh, that thing I was taught only applies in a limited number of circumstances, and there are all these other circumstances that you encounter every day where that particular piece of information doesn't actually apply. The underlying assumptions are violated, and you're like, well, crap, now I have to unlearn this stuff that I learned early on. And that's part of the struggle of being in college, is not just learning new stuff, but unlearning stuff that you learned was incorrect before. And I think Thanksgiving is a classic example of that. Anything that is culturally, tied up in cultural happenings has the opportunity to get misinterpreted at various points. And if you got the same story about Thanksgiving that I got when I was a child, it's really fairly glossed over. And so this anthropology paper, it delves into the history of how Thanksgiving has changed over time in the United States, from back in the 1600s until the present. And then it also tries to place the celebration in the context of historically what was happening at the times that these changes in how we treat Thanksgiving were occurring, and kind of how the myth came to be what it is today. And I'm using myth in kind of the, I don't remember if it's lowercase or uppercase myth. Myth as in a story we tell, not necessarily that it's an untrue story that we tell, but it's just a story that we tell. And in some cases, myths have a lot of truth in them, and in other cases, myths are just totally made up. And so, anyway, it'll be hopefully an interesting read. I'm interested in seeing what you think about it after you read it. So hopefully do that part before Thanksgiving. So do the first do the first 3 prompts before we get to Thanksgiving, and leave the last prompt out after Thanksgiving. All right. So other questions? All right, let's talk about, continue to talk about the organic standards and organic labeling. So we were talking about plant crops, we talked about, oh, this isn't on yet. We talked about, for crops, land must have no prohibitive substance applied to it for at least 3 years before the harvesting. Soil fertility and crop nutrients will be managed through tillage and cultivation practices, crop rotation, cover crops, supplemented with animal and crop waste materials, and allowed synthetic materials. Crop pests, weeds, and diseases will be controlled primarily through management practices, including physical, mechanical, and biological controls. And I think this is where we ended up, if I'm recalling correctly. Because we went and visited the national list of allowed and not allowed substances, and then yeah, so I guess we were finished with plants, because I think that's all there was for plants. So when we talk about animals, this is once again just taken directly from the fact sheet. Animals for slaughter must be raised under organic management from the last third of gestation to no later than the 2nd day of life for poultry. So the status of the parents, if you're having organic pork or organic cows or sheep or whatever, you have to raise the pregnant individuals from the last third of gestation, whatever that happens to be. It varies by species. And at the 2nd day of life, after the 2nd day of life for poultry, producers must feed livestock agricultural feed products that are 100% organic, but they might also provide vitamin and mineral supplements. So in order to have organic livestock, you have to feed them organic feed, and that means either feeding them on pasture, or it means feeding them grain feedstocks and soy feedstocks that are also grown organically. And so you not only have to control your own processes on your animal operation, but you also have to make sure that your producers are adhering to organic standards as well. And so you can only buy your feed from organic feed suppliers. All of these things essentially raise the cost of providing meat that is certified organic, because obviously organic produce is going to be more expensive as well. Dairy animals must be managed organically for at least 12 months in order for milk or dairy products to be sold, labeled, or represented as organic. Preventive management practices must be used to keep animals healthy. Producers may not withhold treatment from sick or injured animals. However, animals treated with a prohibited substance may not be sold as organic. So one of the ways that you could achieve being organic is not giving your animals antibiotics when they're sick, because antibiotics are on the prohibited list of things. But that can't be a good organic practice, because you're allowing an animal to stay in the food supply that is diseased, has a bacterial infection in this case. But what that means is that as soon as you do something to improve the health that requires the introduction of a prohibited substance, then you have to take that animal out, and that animal cannot be sold and labeled as organic. And so the health of the animal is at issue here. And so organic practices are practices that see to the health of the animal. This is from a different document. Organic livestock are managed without antibiotics, added growth hormones, mammalian or avian byproducts, or prohibited feed ingredients. But once again, none of this can negatively impact the health of the organism. And so you can't deny a cow antibiotics if the cow is sick. It's just that you administer those antibiotics, but then you can't sell that animal as an organic cow. Ruminants, which are things like cows, must be out on pasture for the entire growing season, but for not less than 120 days. So depending on where you are latitudinally, the growing season varies. If you're in the south, the growing season, the amount of time during the year that you can have animals out on pasture is the entire year. If you're in the north, the minimum growing season is 120 days, which is significantly less than the whole year. So how long you have to have your animals out on pasture depends on how long during the year pasture is in good shape for grazing. And so if you're in North Dakota, for example, you have to have your animals out on pasture at least 120 days because that's going to be the minimum amount that you can have, because that's the minimum growing season, because that's the furthest north state that we have that does regular cattle operations. So the remainder, so we have 365 days in a year. So for the remaining 245 days of the year, you can have these animals in barns or in feedlots or whatever, obviously to protect them from the inclement weather. If any of you guys have ever been to North Dakota in the winter, it's cold, so you can have them in barns, but when they are in these barns, you have to feed them at least 30% of their feed or dry matter intake must be from pasture. So 30% of their food must come from pasture. So that means if you're an organic producer in a state like North Dakota, you need to be providing your animals essentially stockpiled hay that you've grown during the growing season that you then stockpile so that you can feed your animals through the winter. So outside the grazing season, ruminants must have free access to the outdoors except under specified conditions. These are mainly having to do with inclement weather, but then also ruminant slaughter stock are exempt from the percent DMI dry matter intake from pasture required for the last fifth of their lives up to 120 days. So if you look at the lifespan of an animal from birth to death, well, I didn't do that correctly. So during this whole time period, you have to have them either on pasture, or if not on pasture, in a barn with 30% dry matter intake from pasture. Except slaughter stock are, so any ruminants that are going to be slaughtered and sold for meat are exempt from the 30% DMI from pasture requirement for the last fifth of their lives. So, it's 120 days times 5. So 600 days would be the lifespan of an animal if you wanted to take advantage of a full 120 days of the last fifth of its life, where you basically don't have to feed them under these organic standards. When you're finishing a cow, what does that mean when you're finishing an animal for slaughter? What this term refer to? I've used it a couple of times, but I probably never really defined it very well. Michael Pollan, back in the first part of the book, in a chapter that you guys didn't read, he bought a cow. I've mentioned this cow a couple of times now. Cow 34, 534, lived out its life for 6 months on a pasture in South Dakota, and then was shipped off to Pokey Feeders in western Kansas, north of Garden City, Kansas, where it went to a concentrated animal feeding operation. Why send an animal to a concentrated animal feeding operation?
Access, they have easier access to food.
Yeah, but what kind of food in particular?
Like grains.
They have access to grains and soybeans and things like this. And so they're going to eat those grains, get a lot of energy from those grains, because those grains have more energy per ounce than grass does. Grass is a relatively low energy sort of food for an animal. And what it does is it causes them to gain weight faster, so they get to market faster. Not only that, as they are in these concentrated animal feeding operations and they're getting this high calorie food, they're packing on some fat as well. One of the problems with grass-fed beef is that it's amazingly lean. And it's lean because it's not high in caloric content, and as a result, most of the energy is going to building up protein and very little of the energy is being stored as fat. When you buy a brisket or a steak or anything else, do you want that thing to be free of fat? Why not, Brandon?
Because the fat is what has flavor.
Yeah, so it's what keeps it moist. If you have a non-fatty steak and you go to grill that thing, it's going to turn out like shoe leather even if you don't overcook it, because it doesn't have any lipid keeping that thing moist. And so you want a little of what a chef would refer to as marbling. You guys ever go buy steak at the store? No? You don't grill steaks out?
My dad does, not me. I'm not the one going to the store.
Next time your dad goes to the store to get steaks, go with him. You will probably see him picking up the steak that is available and looking at it and examining it. He just doesn't grab the first thing out of the freezer compartment there, or the refrigerator compartment there. He's looking at it because you want a steak that has a certain level of marbling, because that marbling is basically just little layers of fat intermixed with the meat, so that when you grill that, the fat that is there keeps it moist and provides flavor. But the main thing that it does is the beef itself provides flavor, but the marbling keeps it moist and keeps it from turning out too tough. And so the leanness of grass-fed beef is sometimes a negative attribute of grass-fed beef because it lacks those layers of fat. And as a result, it sometimes feels tough to people, and so you have to do things with it that may keep it from getting tough as you're preparing it. And so when you send a cow to a concentrated animal feeding operation, you're sending it there because it's going to pack on more pounds faster, and a certain number of those pounds are going to be fat pounds. And that actually improves the quality of the meat for human consumption in terms of taste and cookability and things like this. So under these organic standards, you have to put these animals on pasture their entire life, but if you have an animal that is intended for slaughter, you are exempt from this pasture component for the last fifth of its life. What does that enable you to do as an organic producer? Right before slaughter, you can bring them into the barn and feed them what?
Great.
Feed them a bunch of grain. You can finish them the same way that you would finish non-organic beef. Now, what kind of grain do you have to be feeding them?
Organic.
Hmm? You have to be feeding them organic grains, but you can finish them the same way that you would finish any other conventional beef, by giving them this high-calorie diet at the end of their life to get them to bulk up, add some fat layers onto that so that you have a product that kind of meets people's culinary expectations. And so in this way, organic beef production isn't that different from regular beef production, except that there's a heavy reliance on pasture feeding up until you're preparing the animal for slaughter. Once you're preparing the animal for slaughter, you basically do what conventional beef producers do, which is bring them into a concentrated area where you can control their diet. You feed them grains to bulk them up, and it just so happens that those grains have to be organically raised, organically produced grains. This gives you then an organic beef product that is raised under pretty good conditions for most of its life, and then is given a fairly unnatural diet at the end of its life to produce, once again, beef that adheres to the consumer's expectation of what a decent steak will be, or a decent brisket will be. And so you can go through the process of finishing your organic cattle because you're freed up from this pasture standard in the last fifth of the animal's life. So there shouldn't really be much difference between the beef of conventionally raised beef and organically raised beef because of this end of life exemption in terms of taste and how you would cook it and things like that. Grass-fed beef, on the other hand, are very different. If you raise your beef up until the time that you slaughter them, they're going to be much leaner than conventional or organically raised beef. So yeah, that's all that. Yeah, so ruminants must be out of the pasture. So why does this appear? Does it disappear to us? No, it didn't appear to us. Oh yeah, so all organic livestock and poultry are required to have access to the outdoors year-round. Animals may only be temporarily confined due to documented environmental or health considerations. So let's go back to Rosie. Rosie, the organic free-range chicken from Petaluma Poultry. What's the claim that Pullen makes about Rosie's life? What does he say about Rosie's life?
She doesn't have a better life
Okay, why do you say that?
because she's allowed to go outside, but she's not gonna take the option because she was never able. They're not like allowed to go outside until 5 weeks. So maybe see.
Yeah, so where is that? I'm having trouble locating it in the book.
Remember chapter 9. I have my book with me. I think it's towards the end, sort of. Towards the end, sort of the chapter 9. I don't remember.
I'm trying to, there's a section where it actually talks about the number of weeks, and I'm just having trouble putting my finger on it at the moment.
I think I wrote down 5.
Yeah, I think it's 5 weeks in the thing,
Like they
2
have to
weeks
be
with
5
doors
weeks old, or
before they open the doors.
Yeah.
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 So in the section, it starts around page 171. Rosie, the organic chicken's life is a little different from that of her kosher or Asian cousins, all of whom are conventional Cornish cross growers, processed according to state-of-the-art industrial practice, though Petaluma Poultry sets the bar higher than many of its competitors who routinely administer antibiotics and use feed made from animal byproducts. The Cornish cross represents the pinnacle of industrial chicken breeding. It's the most efficient converter of corn into breast meat ever designed, though this efficiency comes at a high physiological price. The birds grow so rapidly that their poor legs cannot keep pace and frequently fail. After a tour of the fully automated processing facilities, which can translate a chicken from a cluckling feathered bird to shrink-wrapped pack of parts inside of 10 minutes, the head of marketing drove me out to meet Rosie pre-processing. The chicken houses don't resemble a farm so much as a military barracks, a dozen long, low-slung sheds with giant fans at either end. I donned what looked like a hooded white hazmat suit since the birds received no antibiotics, yet living close to confinement. The company is ever worried about infection, which could do a whole house overnight, and stepped inside. 20,000 birds moved away from me as one, like a ground-hugging white cloud, clucking softly. The air was warm and humid and smelled powerfully of ammonia. The fumes caught in my throat. 20,000 is a lot of chickens, and they formed a gently undulating white carpet that stretched nearly the length of a football field. After they adjusted to our presence, the birds resumed sipping from waterers suspended from the ceiling, nibbled organic food from elevated trays connected by tubes to a silo outside. It did pretty much everything chickens do except step outside the little doors located at either end of the shed. Compared to conventional chickens, I was told these organic birds have it pretty good. They get a few more square inches of living space per bird, and because there are no hormones or antibiotics in their feed to accelerate growth, they live to a few days longer. Though under the circumstances, it's not clear that a longer life is necessarily a boon. Running along the entire length of each shed was a grassy yard, maybe 15 feet wide, not nearly big enough to accommodate all 20,000 birds inside, should the group ever decide to take the air en masse, which, truth be told, is the last thing the farm managers want to see happen, since these defenseless, crowded, and genetically identical birds are exquisitely vulnerable to infection. This is one of the larger ironies of growing organic food in an industrial system. It is even more precarious than a conventional industrial system. But the federal rules say an organic chicken should have, quote, access to the outdoors, and Supermarket Pastoral imagines it. So Petaluma Poultry provides the doors and the yard, and everyone keeps their fingers crossed. It would appear Petaluma's farm managers have nothing to worry about, since the food and water and flock remain inside the shed, and since the doors remain shut until the birds are at least 5 weeks old and well settled into their habits. This is where the 5 weeks is. And well settled into their habits, the chickens apparently see no reason to venture out into what must seem to them an unfamiliar and terrifying world. Since the birds are slaughtered at 7 weeks, free range turns out to be not much of a lifestyle for these chickens as a 2-week vacation option. So my question to you is, if this is the organic standard, how on earth can Petaluma Poultry keep chickens in their barns for 5 weeks without access to the outside world? Then the doors are open. They're allowed 2 weeks of access, what Poland refers to as a vacation option, to go out into this grassy yard, and then at the end of that 2 weeks, they are slaughtered.
And they're considered organic.
And they are considered organic because they're eating organic feed. They're raised according to organic standards. So if this is what's true, so your choice is Poland is lying, or what in the standards allows them to do this and still label Rosie an organic chicken?
There's gotta be some loophole that I'm not understanding.
The loophole is before you.
Yeah, but.
The loophole is written into the standards, Charlie. Where is
Yeah,
it?
I understand.
I mean, are they not considered like full chickens until after 5 weeks?
Nope, they're chickens. They're chickens.
It has something to do with,
Wait, go back. They're chickens as of the second day of life.
it has something to do with, the documented, confined to, animals may be temporarily confined to documented environmental or due to documented environmental or health considerations.
We have to keep them in the chicken house, because as they're developing, because they're being held at high densities, et cetera, we worry about environment and health considerations. And so they keep them in the houses for this time period, and they eventually do provide them access to the outdoors, but presumably it's at a time period in the chicken's life when the animal is capable of defending itself from predators, et cetera, et cetera. And so Poland is presumably not lying, because he has yet to be sued for libel by Petaluma Poultry. And so there are provisions in the organic standards that allow you to graze organic poultry, essentially using the same techniques that you use in conventional poultry production. The primary difference is you're not allowed to give them growth hormones, you're not allowed to give them antibiotics, you're not allowed to feed them animal parts as part of their food, and you have to feed them with organically raised feed, organically produced feed. But in all other ways, they're basically raised in big chicken houses the way conventional chickens are raised. Yes?
And pulling to the point, he's saying at those 2 weeks they have, since they've already been inside for 5 weeks, they're not gonna go out there anyways because they don't know any better.
Yeah, they're conditioned to live in the chicken houses. That's what they're used to. Also, that's where all their food and water is. If Petaluma Poultry really wanted the chickens to go outside, what would you put outside? You put food and water outside for them. Why would you go outside if all of your food and water and the environment, the only environment that you've known your entire life is inside the chicken house? There's no reason for you to do that. If you look at Joel Salatin's grass-fed chickens, there's an electrical fenced enclosure. There is a chicken coop in the center. The main purpose of that chicken coop is for the chickens to go in there to lay eggs and get out of inclement weather if it's really cold or really rainy or something like that. But most of the space that is in this enclosure is actually just pasture. And the chicken house is primarily the place where chickens go in and lay eggs. And so if you look at Joel Salatin's chickens, they live the majority of their life out of doors on pasture, which is very different from a conventionally raised chicken that lives its entire life inside of these gigantic chicken houses that you can see when you drive down the highways. And so Poland could be lying, but my guess is he would have been sued by now had he been lying, and I haven't heard of him being sued. After I stepped back outside into the fresh air, grateful to escape the humidity and ammonia, I waited by the chicken door to see if any of the birds would exercise that option, and strolled down the little ramp to the grassy yard, which had been mowed recently, and I waited. I finally had to conclude that Rosie, the organic free-range chicken, doesn't really grok the whole free-range conceit. The space that has been provided to her for that purpose is, I realize, not unlike the typical American front lawn it resembles. It's a kind of ritual space intended not so much for the use of the local residents as a symbolic offering to the larger community. Seldom, if ever, stepped upon, the chicken house lawn is scrupulously maintained, nevertheless, to honor an ideal nobody wants to admit has by now become something of a joke and empty pastoral conceit. So when Poland uses the term industrial pastoral in this chapter, is that a compliment or is it kind of an insult? It's an insult, this idea of organic pastoral, because you have this nice grassy area that is provided for chickens that the chickens never use and the producer never intends for them to use. And so, yeah, the free-range chicken is not terribly free-range. Why can they refer to this chicken as a free-range chicken?
Because it has the option.
No.
There's no restrictions on free range.
This is not a term that the U.S. Department of Agriculture Agricultural Marketing Service recognizes. You could keep your chickens shackled in their place in the chicken barn with little chicken handcuffs and call them free range. Why? There's no labeling standards for that term. Although I've now fixed in your brains the image of little chickens shackled to their roost with little chicken handcuffs.
Doesn't bother me as long as they taste the same.
It doesn't bother you as long as they taste the same. And thus is how conventional farming can stay conventional farming. So here's the thing that I want you to recognize. Some labels that you see on your food have meaning. Other labels that you see on your food have no meaning whatsoever. As a consumer, it would be important for you, if you want to make choices about the food that you buy and eat, it would be important for you and useful to you to know which labels are regulated such that you can't put those labels on your food without suffering the litigation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and which labels don't have regulations associated with them. Free range is one of the things that has no standards associated with it. All natural. Has no standards associated with it. GMO free has traditionally not have standards associated with it. Now, there are new standards that have been proposed that are currently being approved, and I can't remember if they've been approved yet or not, that is going to regulate this labeling. But I think at the moment at least, and this is something that's rapidly changing, I think at the moment that these standards are not yet in place. Now, you can't call your food organic and have genetically engineered organisms in the feed, in the food stocks, or in the product itself. And so this is covered partly underneath organic standards, but remember that organic labeling standards, there are 3 levels of organic. There is 100% organic, there is organic, and then there is made with organic. And each of those things have different standards that are required to be met in order to put those labels. So those labels are governed by the Agricultural Marketing Service. So handling standards. Not only do you have to raise your plant crops and raise your animal livestock according to organic standards, you also have to handle these things appropriately. So all non-agricultural ingredients, whether synthetic or non-synthetic, must be allowed according to the National List of Allowed and Prohibited Substances. We've already looked at that list briefly. It's long. A lot of things are allowed, fewer things are not allowed. In a multi-ingredient product labeled as organic, all agricultural ingredients must be organically produced unless the ingredient is not commercially available in organic form, and there's a separate list of things that are not commercially available. Handlers must prevent the commingling of organic with non-organic products and protect organic products from contact with prohibited substances. Products sold and labeled as and represented as organic must have at least 95% certified organic. Products sold, labeled, or represented as made with organic must have at least 70% organic content, and products containing less than 70% organic content may identify specific ingredients as organic in the ingredient list, but you can't label that product as a whole as being organic. So even if you label something organic, it only has to have 95% organic content. And so labeling for organic substances, organic food on the market is regulated by the USDA. You have to have your certified organic inspector come out and inspect your operation. I think if I recall, they do this in 2-year review cycles, but an organic investigator can show up at your farm at any point, just like a health inspector can show up at your restaurant at any point. They don't have to announce their visits, but normally they're scheduled every couple of years to ensure that you're continuing your organic practices. When the inspector comes out, you have to produce logs over the previous time period since your last inspection. that document that you've been adhering to organic practices. Those logs are reviewed by the organic inspector, as well as the organic inspector looking at your current operations on the day or the week that he or she comes out and inspects your farm. And those logs just show ongoing practice that once again conforms to the organic standards that you're attempting to achieve. If you're raising livestock, you have to be careful about which processing plant you send your livestock to for processing. And so you have to have one that generally maintains a separate processing line for organic livestock as opposed to non-organic livestock, because meat processing plants are messy places, and it's very difficult to keep the commingling of organic and non-organic livestock separate in these facilities. And so almost all organic processors are conventional processors, but they have a separate processing line that is devoted to organic livestock, which once again is one of the reasons that it costs more to produce organic livestock or organic meat than it does non-organic meat, is because the organic producer is charged for the added expense of maintaining extra equipment at a processing plant to just handle organic livestock. That's organic, that's industrial organic. The processes aren't that different than conventional organic. If you buy your organic mixed greens from Earthbound Farms, they are raised largely on large monoculture farms in California. The difference is that they basically get rid of weeds and things like this through increased tillage, rather than the use of herbicides being sprayed on herbicide-resistant genetically engineered lettuce. And because of this, it's more energy intensive to grow organic lettuce, organic greens, than it is to grow non-organic greens, because you're constantly having to invest fossil fuel in running the tractors that do the tilling. As we talked about last time, the active tilling increases things like soil erosion. Organic, for its benefits, also has a set of costs that are associated with it. You probably haven't read this literature. Why would you shell out more money to buy organic mixed greens rather than conventional mixed greens?
Makes people feel good about themselves.
Okay, so there's this emotional thing where you feel good about yourself. So it satisfies an emotional need. Why else would you pay extra money for organically produced produce rather than conventionally produced produce?
In theory, it's more healthier.
Okay, so there's this emotional satisfaction.
It just makes you think that it was all natural and it's grown by like maybe healthy farmers. Like that's what I think of when I think of organic. Like
So here's the thing with this idea of health, of organic produce being healthier. There have been studies done by scientists where they have looked at the nutrient content. So when we think of healthier, we might think that it is, higher in, trace elements that are important for health. It might be higher in protein. It might be lower in carbs, carbohydrates. All of these things would represent kind of a healthier sort of option. It certainly lacks antibiotics. And lacks, if you're eating meat, growth hormones. Certainly organic materials are less likely to have pathogens because of the kinds of fertilizers that you can use on them. You're not allowed to use things like sewage sludge, so they're probably less likely to have pathogens, except when we go back to plant crops, where is it? How did it not make it into my list? Well, let's go back to the actual PDFs. How did I miss this?
Assuming you're about to say something about how organic stuff isn't actually healthier.
Oh, I'm about to say a lot of things.
That's why I said in theory.
You guys have gotten to know me a little bit. Oh, how did I miss this? Under crop standards, what's this last thing? Oh, because I got it mixed up with sewage sludge. It's all down here. The use of genetic engineering, ionizing radiation, and sewage sludge is prohibited. What is ionizing radiation? Anybody? 3 Mile Island? Oh, that's before your time, isn't it? You guys know what 3 Mile Island is? No?
Is that
Yes?
like radiation, like a certain, the plant for energy, like?
Thermonuclear reactor at
Yeah.
3 Mile Island outside of, is it Hagerstown? Pennsylvania, the state capital of Pennsylvania, Hagerstown? Pennsylvania's on this island in the middle of a river. Their reactor melted down. There was radiation contamination. What's the bad thing about radiation?
Can kill you.
It kills things. And so one of the things that, for example, an organic a greens producer, a conventional producer of spinach and arugula and lettuce and things like this would do, is because they use manure in some cases to fertilize their fields, there's the risk of the microbes that are found in the manure getting on the lettuce. This is why in 2006, when I was on my bicycle ride, they had to take a lot of these greens off of market, is because the greens had been contaminated by Escherichia coli, which is an intestinal bacteria that is commonly found in organisms' guts. They're found in our guts, they're found in the guts of cattle. But the way that you get rid of those kinds of pathogens is as you're processing those greens after they've been harvested, you wash them, but after you've washed them, you send them through a treatment of ionizing radiation. You expose the pathogens to radiation so that you kill those things. So while it's less likely to have pathogens because of the kind of fertilization scheme that you're adhering to as an organic producer, they're actually more likely to have pathogens because it's harder to sterilize things. Because you're not allowed to use things like antibiotics if you're dealing with livestock, and you're not allowed to use things like ionizing radiation if you're dealing with produce. And so it's kind of a two-edged sword. Now, as far as nutrition is concerned, are these things healthier because they have higher levels of trace elements that are important for you, higher levels of vitamins that are important to you, higher in protein, lower in carbohydrates, et cetera, et cetera? Numerous studies have been done, and guess what they have found?
They're not healthy.
Nutritionally, there's no differences in the nutrition value of organic versus conventionally raised crops. And there have been a lot of studies on this because this is one of the claims that are made by organic producers. So there's no nutritional difference. The other thing then is, are organically raised crops better for the environment? And I would argue that it's something of a mixed bag. Are they using fewer pesticides? Yes, they are. Are they using fewer herbicides? Yes, they are. But the flip side of that is that those things basically means that more of the crop gets wasted. So you have to farm more acres of organic crops in order to get a similar yield, a similar total yield. So the yield per acre is lower on organic operations because of the lack of pest control methods available to you, the lack of herbicide treatments available to you, things like this. So environmentally, it generally requires more acreage to produce the same amount of food. And then you're also prone to things like soil erosion and nutrient losses from the soil because of things like increased tillage. So as an ecologist, when I think of it environmentally, it's kind of a mixed bag for me as to whether this is better for the environment than conventional production of produce in particular. When I go to the store and I end up buying organic, it's often because I can find an organic version of a product that I can't find that is conventionally produced. Because I walk around with this sort of cognitive dissonance in my mind, when I see something that is labeled organic, I have to run it through everything that I know about the organic system and say, well, you know, is it really better for me to be buying something that is organically produced versus conventionally produced? And I don't really have a good answer for that, which is why when I go to the grocery store, I'm actually pretty ambivalent about this particular consumer decision. And this is the problem with becoming educated about something. I don't have a knee-jerk reaction. Like, I go to the produce section, must buy all organic products. And it's because I know too much about how organic stuff gets grown compared to conventional production that I can't just go all in on organics.
I would argue a lot of people buy organic strictly because it makes them feel better.
This is probably
In their mind, it
the
tastes
main
better.
thing. It makes me feel good to do this.
I
This is the problem with becoming an educated, critical thinking adult. Less and less feels good over time. I'm sorry to say that's the case, because you can free yourself from this emotional attachment to things, because that emotional attachment is based on a set of facts that aren't actually accurate. And sorry to be a buzzkill, but that's kind of the way of things. The more you build knowledge and nuance into what you do on a daily basis, the less prone you are to emotional swings one way or another. You become very moderate. Some people would consider you to be boring, because you don't get really enthused about any one particular thing, perhaps. Sydney, do you have a question?
Yeah, so like farmers markets, they have different standards for organic, and that like varies from person, right?
No. So if you're going for organic certification, you have to follow the federal rules.
Yeah.
And so you don't, as a farmer, have a lot of freedom to vary what you do on your farm. You have to do it.
I just know like
according to
the
what their standards are.
farmers market that I go to,
Uh-huh.
like in Overland Park,
Mhm.
they like